ahead.
Okay. Hi. So this is a talk about the current state of idiomatic Android development. And I'll just get right into it. So content, we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about activities, views, and XML. The rise of MVP out of nowhere, which I don't think is anyone's favorite architectural patent, but kind of like, it was there and it helped through some interesting times in Android land. Google's current opinion, which is something along the lines of MVVM. And then we're going to do a little demo, and then there'll be a survey. Alright, so first we're talking about activities, views, and XML. So in the early days of Android, activities were pretty much everything. Activities were the view, they were the data layer, they hosted business logic. There was a time, this is a dark time, when we used to use async tasks for everything, and hold a strong reference to the activity, and the source of logic where it was and there. They were pretty much God objects. Every piece of UI was its own activity, it had its own async task, you could have several async tasks. And when you wanted to do anything long running, you'd probably have to extend intense service or something like that. But it was just the way things were done. Also, back in activities was XML. And they were similarly used to HTML, where HTML was you just describe your view, and then to style it, you get CSS. If you wanted to manipulate it, you use JavaScript. So Android had the exact same idea with XML. Now, XML is tightly integrated with the Android Asset Package tool, which is also called AAPT. And XML is also the process statically declared items in Android, whether these be styles, you can do transitions. I personally prefer not to do transitions this way, but you can define transitions in XML, you can define animations, and vector drawings are recently added support and also done in XML. And another really cool thing about XML is because it's so tightly integrated with AAPT, whenever you declare an ID in a view hierarchy, we ought to be unique in that view hierarchy. When there's a process death, and an Android path is dying, it's going away, and will be restored at whatever time, Android uses the ID of that view to preserve that view state. So like, if you had an app, you open 10 million apps, you're watching YouTube, and you come back to it, let's say you were scrolling a list, you go at the bottom of that list, the ID of that view is what Android is going to use to parcel that, so that when you come back, even if the app is completely dead and you're going to get into review, it's going to restore your scroll state to the part where you left off. If your views don't have IDs when your app is restarted, but depending on the phone and manufacturer, because Android, Samsung likes to do weird things a lot, your app will crash, or you just lose your view state, which will be packed at the top of the view, all that kind of stuff. But that's what XML is really good for, declaring static things that don't change, because AAPT will create a Java file in your resources, and then it will create all those things for you, so you don't have to do it yourself. But this scaled really, really poorly. You had this activity that were God objects, and it just wasn't fun. You couldn't separate things out. It was really hard to reuse things. It wasn't fun. Google realized this, and in 2011, with Android Honeycomb, which debuted on the Mobile Zoom, Google introduced the Fragment API. However, born from Douglas Adams, this has made a lot of people very angry and widely regarded as a bad thing. People do not like fragments, and for very good reason. The guy on the right, he is PY. He's a very well-known Android developer. He works at Square. He is the author of Leak Canary, which we use here in to check if he's leaked any sources and whatnot. This was pulled from his Twitter profile yesterday. He is Android at Square, author of Leak Canary and Android Annotations, killer of fragments. People do not like fragments, and for very good reason. At the very top of here, I have the fragment lifecycle, the LOL cycle, because fragments were very unpredictable because they were containing activities, so they had all of the lifecycle callbacks of activities, and they also had their own lifecycle callbacks that were unique to them. And you could have, your fragment could be detached from the activity, and if you try to show a view in that detached state, you would get a crash. It was just this very unpredictable mess. Fortunately for me, I started Android development in 2013 as a hobby, went pro, professional 2014. I was a grad student at the University of Michigan, and I decided I was doing manufacturing engineering. That wasn't cool. Android was cool. So I switched to that. But fortunately for me, fragments were introduced in 2011. I started doing professional in 2014. Google had fixed most of the issues with fragments, so I never had that, bad taste of fragrance in my mouth. So fortunately for me, when I was starting out, I started out with fragrance and I've used them ever since. And I happen to love them, which I've gotten a lot of weird stares from Android developers for one reason or another, but I love fragrance. But the point is, somewhat around 2014, fragments are not semi-stable because there were still some weird quirks. Those are still pretty bad, or big bad, because you gave them this API and it just didn't work. Around this time, some Android developers were like, look, Google isn't really being a steward for us. They're really pretty much putting that time and effort elsewhere. We are going to start forming our own opinions on Android development. On the right, I have Action Bar Sherlock. What is Action Bar Sherlock? Action Bar Sherlock was one of the biggest, and I think it was the library that actually shot Jake Wharton, aka Android Jesus, to fame. If you haven't heard of Jake Wharton, you should look him up. He's a pretty cool guy. He doesn't have finger anything, and he does cool things and stuff. So weird, remember. Spoke something like that. But he created Action Bar Sherlock, and what Action Bar Sherlock did was, so Android Honeycomb came along. Google had this, Tron, Xeon UI and whatnot. Then they went to a new UI with Android KitKat. When they did that, the support library only backported, it wasn't called material design that I had made, it only backported that UI up to KitKat. If you're running Honeycomb or Froyo or Gingerbread, which were very dominant versions of Android at the time, you wouldn't get this UI. And it was kind of annoying. So Jake Martin took it upon himself to backport all the features in all the UI stuff, a bunch of things, in the high API versions. He backported it back to Android 2.2 Froyo. And single individual did that. And that is what, if you're making apps professionally again, you probably use Action Bar Sherlock. I was in a research lab. I was just, messing around with stuff, so I didn't have to do with Action Bar Sherlock, but I'm only very good things from it. So much so that a lot of the internal APIs in Action Bar Sherlock were actually lifted into the support library. Because, if you're Google and one person is doing a better job at providing a developer experience than the rest of it, it's not a good one. But the important thing is the Android community is now beginning to form opinions of Android development independent of Google. Google doesn't really care. They're just like, okay, cool, do your own, whatever. So that was 2014. They actually encouraged developers in 2016 to develop their own architectures for their own apps to suit their needs. They did start putting considerable effort into the support library for backporting them. This was one of the hottest posts on Google+. This is by Diane Hackmore. She's an Android framework engineer. Because people were so upset, Google, what do you want us to do? How do you want us to architect our apps? Actually, when I tried to pull this yesterday, Google Plus says you actually had to troll Wayback Machine to find it. I'm really thankful that exists. But she says, we often see questions from developers asking from the Android platform engineers about the kinds of design patterns and architectures we should use. Maybe surprisingly, we don't have a strong opinion. We don't have one at all. And she was right. And the thing about the Android platform team is you can put yourself in their shoes. They're not really trying to architect something for a certain kind of opinion. They're just trying to get the platform to be stable, right? And you can put yourself in their shoes. You can't opine on something because if you have someone that wants to do something else, you're kind of restricting them. So they enforce no opinion whatsoever, right? So I think about it, they're like, this was really hot back in 2016 when it came out. In fact, if you find that Hackmore on Stack Overflow, a bunch of her answers are really, really hot because what she does is she gives an opinion that is well-founded, but it'll piss off a lot of people because it's not what they want. Where can you keep up with just developers? But yeah, do whatever. So people are like, okay, what do we do? Seemingly overnight, Model View Presenter became, from 2017, became the de facto standard in Android across all industries. This was around the time I went to GM. GM was like state-of-the-art MVP. Like, it was ridiculous how strict and how it was like this really big machine that it was easy to find your way around. There was a ton of code, but everything followed the same MVP pattern. And it was everywhere. I think if you went to DroidCon, then you see people talking about some variation of MVP. It just worked. And this is when it lends itself very easily to dependency injection. This is when Dagger 2 was really a thing. You can have interfaces, you can inject implementations with that interface or MVP. In MVP on Android, either the activity or if you're one of of those people that didn't like yourselves or like fragments very much, you would use fragments as the view for MVP. Now, testing was very easy, right? Because your activity or your fragment would implement a view interface, and this view interface was very easy to test because they were essentially just done. You just grab this view, you could mock the view, and then whenever you ran your test, you wouldn't need basic Java in your test. The view is just some, Java interface. You just, mock assertions, check this method was called, so on and so forth. Testing was easy. However, with MVP, it's hella boilerplate because your activity, as much as you would like to make it just a view, it's not a view. The activity is how you request for permissions, it's how you start a service. So what would happen is that with MVP, you have to create the most annoying term that I heard so many times that made me want to rip my hair out. I did rip my hair out. It's a facade, right? Because it has to be facades for everything that you can inject behind the scenes. You need a facade to start an activity. You need a facade to start a service because the activity was just a dumb view. Also, the code is very imperative. Presenters didn't lend themselves very much to composition. You have a presenter. You can't extend a presenter because that presenter presents for just that view. If you had a different view that was similar, extending that presenter, you then have to create an abstract view interface. It didn't scale well. It wasn't nice. Also, tests were very brittle, requiring lots of refactoring for very small changes because MVP is very imperative, right? And when you're writing your test, you're like, assert this view was called once. Assert this was never called. The project manager comes in and is like, okay, we'll like this view to do something else. Now your test is extremely robust. You've covered it. This is what people use. 95% test coverage. Now the project manager wants to change one small thing, and you change the view implementation, and now your tests are just broken. And you haven't really changed anything, right? So MVP tests were extremely brittle, and they weren't fun. In fact, there are lots of times where your code could be improved, but then you see how to improve the code, and then the amount of tests you have to change, the scope of, the breaking changes you make to the test, you're just like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's not really not it. It's not like it. So, around this time when MVP is going on, functional reactive programming is gaining steam again, right? More reactive architectures are being developed. You have MVVM, model view model view intent. And lots of opinions are about. This is also coincidental. At the same time, React is very popular on the web. And React developers had nothing bad to say about React. React was just really beautiful thing. And I didn't understand it then, but in the last 3 months before I left my previous job, I moved to React Native. And I could really see why people really love React. There was a lot of fantastic, great ideas in React. So there's lots of opinions about, almost overwhelming. People are saying, well, how do you do this on Android? Do you do MVP? Do you do MVVM? It's overwhelming to a certain point. And certain disparate factions exist. There's some people that will swear by MVP. There's some people that swear by MVVM, and you just didn't know which one to do or how to do it or why you should do it. Questions raised include, what even is a view? Not even the view class in Android, but what even is a view in the context of Android, right? Because if you're doing MVP, the view is an activity and the activity should be done, right? Or if you're using MVVM, the view binds to something, so your view has a more active rather than a passive role. What exactly is an activity if it can post a fragment? What exactly is a fragment if you can put a fragment inside a fragment? What belongs to what? Everything is just, you just pick something and you run with it. But this was the case in 2017 when Google said, all right, we're just gonna step in here and we're gonna have an opinion, and if you don't like it, shoot, it's our framework. You can do your own thing, but this is how we think it should be done. Now, if you ask Google, because prior, if you check the Android developer docs, and Android was they described it as something that represents whatever the user is doing at any one time, is what an activity is. However, the current refrain for determining what an activity is an entry point to your application. Somewhat akin to a main function is with the C or Java, that is what an activity is. You should have one activity for your app, barring extenuating circumstances. The reason is, fragments are now view controllers. They host views, however, they're not synonymous with views. If it makes sense to use a fragment somewhere, you cannot use a view in the place of a fragment. And when I say view, I'm not talking to you about views in MVP. I mean views in Android view class. So fragments are view controllers. They host views. However, they are not synonymous with views and shouldn't be used in view of an Android view. Fragments are also lifecycle owners because every lifecycle callback in an activity is forwarded to whatever fragment is being shown, and it also has its own. They are lifecycle owners, and they're perfect places for you to represent destinations or routes in your app. You go to a full screen, that's a fragment, that's a new route. And these are Google's opinions. Now, there's some UI and UX advantages to this. Since fragments are view controllers, they have more available to them than just the view. Your fragment is hosting the view. If your fragment as a view controller needs to check, pass something to the view, whether like, do I have permissions, or do I need to start another thing? Fragments, they're aware of so much, and they have hooks into the activity. They have hooks into the view stack. If you have a stack of fragments, you can check the fragment that's behind 1, 2, 3. They have a bunch of information accessible to you that lets you make, you can pretty much do everything you want, right? You can make them as limited in scope as you want or as wide in scope as you want. Now, because you have so much information available to you, fragments are great for orchestrating animations between routes. We kind of, we see the demo now, the shared element transitions, where you have a piece of UI that is on one screen and to another screen. As you go from screen to screen, it just kind of changes and morphs along. Fragments are also great for separating individual UI elements from global UI elements. What do I mean? So, in an Android application, more often than not, you have a toolbar at the top that has a tab on the screen. You also have options in the toolbar right there. You can also have a float in action button, right? Those items can be, depending on your application, can be thought of as global. Every screen has it, right? Some screens show them, some screens don't. The title will change, the icon in the float in action button may change, but those are global, right? However, within a route, you only have things that are route specific to that. And this is very great because every time you go from screen to screen, you're not inflating any float in action buttons, right? Because views are fairly memory intensive on Android. And you have this global ones, you inflate them once and they're always there. You either hide them or you show them, but you don't recreate the same instance of, a different instance of the same kind of view, screen to screen to screen. These are just global. And they also been for querying the Android framework directly. Permission status, starting another app or a callback, etc. Another reason this is great is because activities, they don't have a lifecycle callback for it. They only tell you when you're paused or when you're stopped. Fragments have an extra lifecycle callback called undestroyed view. And what this lets happen is, so let's say you had an activity, an app, and you're 3 screens in. You've seen screen 1, screen 2, screen 3. When you have the third screen and you have a stack of activities, the first 2 activities, the views are still alive. They're still consuming memory. They're not dead. You can't see them. They're just there. You check the Android. They have a layout inspector. When you click the layout inspector, there's a drop down like what screen you want to see for what activity. So if you have multiple activities, you just have multiple views, just alive. It's just what happens when you do with activities. With fragments, every time a fragment is taken off screen, it has a callback called undestroyed view, where you can null and declare the view references. So if you have a stack of fragments, the only view that's going to be alive is the current fragment in place. So that's what fragments are great for. Now, Google also decided to go with MVVM, right? Reactive reactive programming is all the rage. They would like you to use a view model. In our app, a view model is pretty much identical to a reactor. They're pretty much the same thing, different name. In Android, view models have scope, and also view models are better together with Android because they have an API called a view model provider. When you provide a view model, you can either bind the view model scope to an activity. When you do this, it's not quite a singleton, but it's effectively a singleton because you only have one activity and you only have, the view model is going to be automatically declared with the activity. So as far as the app is alive, you have a view model. It's kind of like a singleton, and you can just store state. You can have more data objects. You can just store it there, and it will be there. If you were to take your app on your phone, and that causes the app to be, activity to be destroyed, all that data is still alive in your view model. These things work very well. View models and activities work excellent. Also, you can also bind a view model not to the activity. You could bind it to a fragment. In other words, the view model is now scoped to a route. So you have objects that only should exist for as long as the second screen is alive. Create a view model for it, and it'll be, the scope is very tightly bound. They also added a support for data binding library, which with XML can be used for declarative UI creation. Now, I say declarative, but it's only semi, so it's not nearly as good as you get with CSS or React. And there's an Android library, it's not nearly as good as you get with Angular. But it's something. It's something. Rumors are at Google I/O this year, Google's going to announce their own declarative UI, so we'll see if they do anything about that. But you kind of get it now. It's just not quite as good as, if you're a React developer coming on and use that, but it's just not nearly as good as it. But it's there. Okay. I want to show you a demo about what I was talking about with regards to UI part. So if you don't mind, you can this is one of my open source projects. It's called Android Bootstrap. Like I mentioned last week, I do a bunch of stuff with sockets, and I have a bunch of interest. Either which way, what I'd like to demonstrate is, the first thing you see is something called doggo is fragments. Because who doesn't like dogs? They're all good boys and girls. So I'm going to hit this. And what you see is I have a bunch of dogs, great names like Pecking Friend, Pecking Boy, Lazy Girl, Pecking Girl. They're all good boys and girls. But what I'm going to do is, I want to draw attention to the flow in action button at the bottom that says Taps and Collapse, and the toolbar at the top. Those two are the bits of persistent UI I was talking about. Those are scoped to the activity, because the activity itself can those views. The screen you see underneath of the dogs are actually below this, right? So whenever I hit a dog, watch the animation that's going to happen. It's not quite so smooth. But what happened is, the toolbar will animate itself up away. It's still present in the activity. There's only one toolbar. And the full action button is just going to expand to say adopt the girl, adopt the dog, right? So regardless of what I do, these are like, those two things are global. And from route to route, as the route changes, because I'm using fragments, there's callbacks to let the activity know that, hey, my state has changed. This is what the text should be now, right? And if I were to adopt this, I'm going to start another fragment, another route. And it just looks like, the dog just moved up. Even though they're two completely different routes, right? This one has a dog at the bottom, the other one has a dog in the middle, right? But because I'm using fragments, I can tell the UI that, hey, I'm going from this screen to that screen, and this is the transition I want you to do. So as far as the user is concerned, it just looks like this thing that's just animating gracefully. Things are just coming in and out of the screen. And for me as a user, this is something that delights me. For me as a developer, this is it's a source of pride for me to say like, okay, my UI is just animating from screen to screen to screen, everything just kind of flows along, right? And because I'm using fragments, and each of my fragments, each view of the fragments have IDs, every time I go back to a fragment, even though the last fragment, the view was destroyed, because I use IDs and the state is preserved, it knows exactly what it was, everything comes back to the way it was, and then my scroll position is preserved. Right? If I scroll down to the bottom, and I go to that dog, if I come back, my scroll position is going to be preserved because I'm using fragments with IDs and the state is preserved. Furthermore, another delightful thing is, and it's not apparent to you as a user, but when I go from that route to this route, I actually have a fragment that's hosting multiple fragments, because if I were to slide this from side to side, right? Each screen I slide between, it's a fragment posting multiple fragments in kind of like a list. I did this little karaoke bounce on it. This is kind of fun. But the floating action button is there global, and it changes from dog to dog to dog. Best part of this is if I scroll all the way to the very last dog, and I hit back, because I'm using a fragment and the state is communicated back to the parent activity. When I go back to the UI isn't going to take me to the first dog that I clicked in the list. It's going to scroll to the very bottom, because I'm at the last dog, and it's going to put me right at the bottom of the screen. So if I go back to the top again, right here, if I go back, I'm at that dog. If I go here, scroll, hit that, I'm going to be back at the screen, right? And this is nearly impossible to do with activities. I mean, you could, I say nearly impossible, but the framework already does a lot of these things for you, and it's very easy to let the framework help you out, give you a helping hand rather than try to do your own thing. So that's that. Another one, this one is a little shameless self-promotion. I have this app on the Play Store. It's called Digitalex. It only works for Google Pixel phones, but if you ever wanted to control the brightness of your phone with a fingerprint sensor at the back, you can scroll up and down and increase and reduce the brightness. I'm at 10K installs. With Android Q, they're probably going to kill the API I use. I would like to get to 15K installs before that. So if you're not, help your boy. This download app is DIGILEX, Digitalex. But this app requires certain permissions, and this certain permissions are Google's going to kill. If I go from display, it says enable store settings. You have a floating action button at the bottom. If I go back to this, it says enable brightness settings, and I wish it was really smoother as I was projecting, but the animation is actually really smooth. I'm changing routes, but the floating action button is global, right? It's tied to the activity, and between routes, you're just changing it, going back from back and forth. It really it adds a certain idea of like certain seamlessness. Things don't flash in and out. They're just there and everything just goes. It's very organic, right? And with Google material design, they tell you that UI is material, it's a piece of paper. When you do things like this, it really does bring that thing full circle, right? Because the floating action button is a piece of material that expands and changes depending on the context, right? So that's that for the demo. So I'm just gonna head back into the summary now. Alright, so that's the demo. So, to summarize, Google's opinions are really just that, right? They're opinions. There's multiple ways to do the same thing, and no one is either right or wrong. In fact, for everything that Google says you should do, there's an alternative that lets you do something similar, right? So, like I said, they're merely prescriptive, and alternatives do exist. However, with alternatives, that caveat emptor applies, right? For example, if you use a navigation jetpack component, which is really just brand new, was just stable a couple of months ago. A popular alternative for that is Flow, made by Square. Remember the guy that hates fragments? He's at Square, they made Flow. Flow was really, really good until they just stopped updated and because they hit a roadblock. Again, fragments debuted in 2011. They've only gotten better since then. In the 8 years, they've only become better and better. So the only thing that happens is that should you go an alternative route, you're pretty much tying yourself to the people that developed the alternative route. And Google is only going to improve the tooling and make their own versions better, right? So you can use alternatives, however, can apply. The same thing goes for conductors. If you don't want to use fragments, you just want to use views. Conductor lets you create views and they create their own controllers, and they say that controllers are a lot lightweight, right? This is a simpler alternative to the fragment API, so you don't have to deal with the fragment evolve cycle. The thing is that the fragment doesn't have an evolve cycle anymore. It's actually quite a life cycle, and these things kind of make sense. Conductor is just simpler. But with fragments, you can choose to ignore certain life cycles and only use the ones you want, but you really don't want to give away everything for the case of simplicity in the conductor. And the third one is Anko, and you have data binding with XML. And I'm not even going to pretend Anko is 10 times better than data binding with XML. It's actually no comparison. However, you do tie yourself to them and the release cycle and so on and so forth. But that is about it. We went through the last 7 years, or is it 8 years in Android development. We talked about how Google didn't really care. MVP came, but MVP had its issues, and Google has an opinion, and decided to do certain things a certain way. And you could do it that way, you may not. Every Google audience can announce something to, take what their own offerings and stuff above, because they have the platform team and so on and so forth. But that's about it. That's where we are currently with Android development. They're probably going to do something about the IO this year, and while the IO next year. They'll probably, they hired Jake Wharton, Android Jesus, pretty much, they hired him a year ago, and he's doing Kotlin stuff at Google. I don't know if you've heard of the Android KTX libraries, but that's Jake Wharton. So yeah, interesting times in Android. That is it.
So when you do the transitions between routes, who handles that? Who manages it? Because like in iOS, there's like a special UI view animated transitioning object that literally all it does is like go from one route to another and knows who it's going. Is it similar in Android? They have like a specific object for that, or is that for
It is similar, but they don't give you, so everything is tied to fragments. They have a fragment manager, and you can add a listener to a fragment manager to let you know whether you're going from one route to the next. Now, you can then intercept that listener and say, okay, I'm going from this route. Since I'm on this route, this is the element I want to share with the element of this other route, and I'm going to just tell you what I want to share in between those routes, and then you provide it. I can actually just show you in front of you. Again, this is open source. It's on my GitHub. But so this is the doggle thing. So I have one activity. The main activity is a base activity. It has the full and action button. And then if I go to doggo list fragment, so I'm telling it, so whenever you show a fragment in another fragment, it's called a fragment transaction. So I wrote this method, it's on the base class, provide fragment transaction to the fragment you're going to. And I apologize, this is in Java. One of the reasons I came here is because I had to force myself to get into Kotlin. I was just really, really cozy with Java. But so I check if the fragment I'm going to is not the pager fragment, the one that has multiple dogs, just return null, and it'll do a basic transition, just fade in, fade out. However, if I'm going to the list one, so get the dog that's currently selected, set the exit transition, and again, this is the transition that I said you can declare in XML. I prefer to do it programmatically. I like XML for stuff like static will not change. For animations, I prefer the flexibility here. So the interpolator is fast, slow, and interpolator. The container is the item container. And then I set an exit shared element callback, and I get the image view that's about to show, and I tell it that, okay, for that image view, put this image to it. So transition from this image to the next. Then because a fragment is within an activity, I can just say, get my activity, get the fragment manager, begin the transition. Set reorigin allowed is something you do for complex animations like this, because what that does is, typically when you do a fragment transition, it's going to remove the first fragment completely and bring the next fragment into it. For something like this that I'm transitioning, and I want the fragment I'm showing, I want its view to be fully created first before I try to animate between them. So when I say set reorigin allowed to true, I'm saying, look, make sure the fragment I'm going to has its view fully created, and then you can remove this one and show it so everything looks seamless. And then add the shared element, which is the image view of the dog, and then voila. So yes, they don't provide one for you. Like I said, the platform team just gives you the basic tools for which you have to forge your own thing to do about it. So there's a hook. You can check what fragment is about to show, and if your fragment is interested in doing anything special for that fragment, do something for it. Otherwise, don't do anything for it.